Thank you so much. I just wanted to give the speakers a chance to say a couple words if they have any comments on these two sets of very interesting questions. Yeah, Harry, please.
Okay, is this working? Yes. Yeah, okay. So, one thing I want to suggest that you should be very, very careful of is I'm not sure that you can learn much from what we've said up here. Because the point about failurology, nice neologism, is that it's a retrospective discipline. Nobody knows or thinks they're failing at the time they're failing. I mean, the frauds aside, but I don't think the frauds really belong in this typology proper, okay? So Max Planck's, I don't know if it's true, David will tell me whether this real, and Jutta will be able to tell me whether he really did say this, but he's supposed to have said, science advances funeral by funeral. In other words, nobody ever gives up their view until they're in the grave. We're not quite sure what happens when they're in the grave, but they certainly don't do it by then. And I think that's true, and I think it's the right thing to do. Yeah? Everybody was trying to persuade Joe Weber once, you know, after 1975, give this up, Joe, admit you were wrong. And Joe Weber would never do it. And Joe Weber went to his grave in the year 2000, still believing that he had seen high fluxes of gravity waves. And I found him a tremendous inspiration. And, you know, it's one of the things I've done is I stick to what I think, irrespective of what everybody's telling me. And I think that's what science needs, okay? There is a more difficult question. And the more difficult and relevant question is, what do other people do? So a number of people had to decide whether to try to repeat Joe Weber's early experiments. And Joe Weber had to work very hard to make his results credible enough for other people to put the time and energy into the work to repeat it. That's where the real question of failure lies. Do I spend time and money, especially if it's an empirical investigation, on doing the same as that other guy has done to prove him either right or wrong? And that is an incredible decision, and it's really worth this. I think a really good research program would be to investigate how those kinds of decisions are made.
Well, and also, if those are taxpayer dollars, whether those decisions are the right decisions. Other responses?
Well, sure. So I'll try to be brief. Is this microphone on?
Yeah.
Yes, okay, good, thank you. So thank you to the discussants. I think we'll have a lot of fun chewing on these themes over the next 2 days, not just this morning. I do want to pick up something that Harry was just saying, though, and that's that even if we might laud the kind of bravery, or if not stubbornness, of some of these people who are at first, who refuse to back down in the face of constructive or not so constructive criticism, I do think we have to be cognizant of effects on entire fields. And it's something that I've learned, actually, frankly, from a lot of Harry's work in the gravitational wave case in particular. Fields can develop a kind of bad reputation, or is often called a kind of odor. And so if someone is simply not backing down, will that actually eventually lead to blocking progress in the field because the field takes on a kind of taint? That's something I've been very interested in with the work on the hippies that Harry also knows quite a lot about from the 70s. Whole fields can be in or out of favor, whether that's with program officers at a federal agency or fellow researchers or journal editors, whatever. And I think the kind of psychological, sociological, delicate balance between sticking with your guns and kind of veering into a kind of pig-headedness has an impact beyond the career of one individual. And that's where I think, again, empirically speaking, historians and philosophers and sociologists can and have investigated these questions beyond the role of one laboratory, one researcher. But I think we do have to look at a kind of larger ecosystem, especially, as Pamela reminds us, I mean, LIGO costs more than $1 billion. You know, it's hard to fail very often with that kind of stakes on the line. Put it that way.
I wanted to say a few words related to the points that have been raised about education and communication. And I think, so what I said very quickly at the end, I think there is something there that might be helpful for education that I've actually tried in my own teaching of science undergraduates. When you look very carefully at the generation of knowledge and really look at the details, that's where you will find things that go wrong, or people who don't really know what to do next, and these kinds of things. And I think when you look at the way in which science is communicated in, say, the popular press, it's usually focused on results, not on methods and how science really works. This is why I now call my my course "How Science Really Works." And what I found is that science students don't know that, and that is really interesting because that's not something that they learn in their undergraduate science education. They don't have the vocabulary to talk about these things, and they also, I mean, many times they just do experiments. Well, they are given certain things that they should do. So this kind of an inquiry-based learning, which includes failure or doing things wrong or not getting things to work, that really, I think, is something that undergraduate science students don't experience, and they can't talk about it either.
Can I just say from the perspective of the history of science as well, I'm a historian of science of the early modern period, and I really think that I do exactly the same things in my classes, because a lot of people talk about science literacy as the knowledge of content, right? But I actually think science literacy is about how science works. And one of the ways that science works is, of course, communication. It's a whole endeavor, right? It's a whole huge enterprise that's moving along in a really unprecedented way since about the 1940s. And in, you know, all nations that want to develop, et cetera. So understanding this whole enterprise of science and how it works is, I think, the way that we can get around the simplistic view of science in the journalism as well as in education, and you know, the people who study science in that detailed way are historians, sociologists, and philosophers of science. And so I think that bringing that expertise into science classes and to science students could actually inform them about failures of all kinds, but also just about the enterprise that science is. Any other points? If not, we'll move to audience questions. So please go to the microphone. If you want to ask a question, please go to the microphone.
So it's not a question, it's a comment, because especially because there was this question about...
Could questioners just say who they are?
Yeah, please? I'm Mario Livio, I'm an astrophysicist.
Thank you.
Especially there was this question asked about how do you know when to stop and so on. So unfortunately, I don't think there is a very good answer to that. And the reason I say this is that in the history of science, we have had all kinds of people, and sometimes even within the same person. So I want to just give a few examples. So David mentioned the Bicep 2 result. So the Bicep 2 result is this experiment, incredible experiment at the South Pole, which claimed to have discovered these B modes, which is the sign of inflation. What happened was that, you know, later results, especially by the Planck satellite, showed that all of that was probably the result of just seeing dust. Now, the Bicep 2 people accepted that. So this is an example where the entire Bicep 2 people, they were actually co-authors on the paper that said that the result came from dust. So they accepted that this was actually a mistake. At the same time, one of the greatest astrophysicists of the 20th century, Fred Hoyle, had a wrong model which did not have a Big Bang. It said it was a steady state. And he did not abandon this model till the day he died, in spite of increasing continuous evidence that a Big Bang occurred. Now, he was so smart that he could always invent yet another way of how he can explain the new results. So that's a counterexample. Now, there is one person, Linus Pauling, who actually showed both trends. In the case of, you know, he had a model for the triple helix for the DNA, and within a few months later, he accepted that Watson and Crick got the double helix correct and that his model was wrong. He accepted that. On the other hand, everything he said about vitamin C, he did not accept till the day he died, even though all of that was completely wrong. So even within the same person, we see the two tendencies, and certainly within the community at large, we see this. So there is really no very, very clear way to say, you know, when to stop and what not, unless, you know, there are these cases where, you know, you have a result from an experiment, there are 100 other experiments that show that it is wrong and so on. Okay, this may convince people. But usually it's like Harry said, it's by funerals. I mean, the people who hold the old ideas, they die, and then the new people have the new ideas.
So our next conference will be on humility.
or funeral practices of the sciences. So Mario, thank you for the comment, Mario. Just a quick note, even with Fred Hoyle, and I quite take your point about Hoyle being, you know, we could say at the very least stubborn to his dying day, decades after the community had moved on from that claim. I take that point. On the other hand, I think you'll agree that his passion for his idea led to a number of things that we now take for granted. And we have a fully fleshed out stellar nucleosynthesis theory because he refused to believe in a Big Bang story and pushed and pushed and pushed, and he was indeed very talented. So what's the balance of that career? We can debate.
He's one of my heroes.
Yes, no, I think
and he was a genius.
He was a genius, and he was stubborn and very gifted. And I think there's an example of, again, in this instance, of a productive mistake where clinging to one framework led to a number of things that are literally folded into our reigning theory to this day. So again, it's not all one or the other. He introduced the term as a... Yeah, well, that's... Right.
Harry has a quick comment.
It's really just a question about Bicep 2, because my current understanding of Bicep 2, and I'd like you to put me right if I'm wrong, is that the Bicep 2 announcement was premature, that they hadn't got all the Planck results yet, but they decided to go for it. So it kind of wasn't that surprising that it turned out to be wrong, and therefore not that surprising that they were ready to admit they were wrong.
So it was premature, for sure. On the other hand, they made three possible assumptions about the dust and thought that they excluded that possibility with those three assumptions.
Yeah.
It turned out that there was really more dust than even their most pessimistic ideas thought. So
Yeah, and I agree again with Mario's comment. Just to say quickly, I have several friends and colleagues on the collaboration. This is one cuts close to home for me. My understanding is that there is not unprecedented in this era of very expensive science, high prestige science, is that there are, you know, often as many barriers to effective collaboration as there are incentives. So there are indeed still are Nobel Prizes on the line, as well as other accolades that the scientists care deeply about, funding for next generation, this and that. And there were very strong rules about which multinational collaboration was or was not allowed to share data at certain points with people outside the collaboration. Those groups knew they were in a race to the end. And so there's a structuring of the sort, Harry, that you've taught so many of us about for so long. The structure of collaborations and the rules for engagement between large groups has evolved into a very, very complicated ecosystem. And I think the Bicep 2 episode is an example of that, where the Planck team had data that was not yet to be publicly released or shared, and the Bicep 2 team did, I think, as Mario says, careful internal analyses the best they could, but indeed without lacking some of the data they most needed. I mean, it was, again, it was people racing to get an answer in a very competitive situation where the rules certainly didn't look like the textbook version of scientists looking to share the results and communicate and can't we all get along. It's very, very complicated with these things on the line.
And that textbook version of science, just like the cookbook version of science, doesn't actually exist in reality, but it is a very strong public perception of it.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks very much. My name is Andrew Goldman. I'm a postdoc at Columbia. It seems to me that anything that appears to be a success today may turn out to be a failure, either because maybe the experiment was done incorrectly, or the data will turn out to be wrong within the context of the theory that motivated the experiment, or because future theories may recontextualize or reframe the findings in a way that fundamentally changes the understanding that was original. Okay, given this, in the interim, what are our criteria for success?
Well, this is a good question. So at the moment, and you see in my talk, I talked about the great discovery of September 2015, and subsequently there have been a series of other inspiraling binary black holes discovered, and even marvelously an inspiraling binary neutron star with an electromagnetic correlate, so they say, anyway. But I could easily find you quite a few physicists working in universities who don't believe any of those results. So one of the extraordinary things, well, this is a part of science which I'm sure is not taught in schools. One of the things that you have to learn is how to decide who's on the fringe and who's not on the fringe. And this is extraordinarily difficult. I mean, we have made a study of this. We made a study of fringe scientists. There's a, you can find them, you can locate them, they have their meetings and so on and so forth. They don't call themselves fringe scientists, but they have alternative views to most of the other science. For instance, they don't believe the theory of relativity is true. And we discovered that there seemed to be some sort of systematic difference between people who don't believe the theory of relativity is true and others, and that is they have a different value of what Thomas Kuhn, the famous historian of science, called the essential tension. And the essential tension is between people who realize they've got to stick to mainstream orthodoxy if they want to make any progress, and people who think that they have to do Galileo-like radical innovation if they're doing the real science. And the fringe scientists think that sticking to orthodoxy is a bit in for a dig, and what you've really got to be trying to do is invent something brand new all the time. That's the only way to make real progress in science. So you've got to look for these sort of systematic differences. But it's a sort of social skill which you can't teach because we don't really know how we do it, how we decide, okay, I'm going to assign this person to the fringe and not take them seriously any longer. But I've still got to take this person seriously, even though he's, I don't like him very much, but nevertheless, somehow or other, I've got to take him seriously. So it's a very, very difficult answer to that question.
I mean, what you're saying is that the social dynamics of scientific communities are very, very important, and you could look at the social dynamics of other kinds of communities as well to understand success and failure, that science, has particular characteristics, but not so different in many ways from other kinds of expertise and other kinds of professional communities.
Yeah,
Jutta.
Yeah, I think it really also depends on what exactly we mean by failure, because I mean there's a more pedestrian understanding of failure, which is relative to a goal. So in the sense that, okay, you want to reach a goal and you cannot reach, you are unable to reach that goal, and so you fail. So, and if you take that as your understanding of failure, then I think error is actually the more interesting term, because when we go back to the roots of error, it's actually erring in the sense of you don't know where you are going. So it's this groping around in the dark, and that is that there is no goal or no, you can't even, you are not even sure where you are. So erring in the sense of not having an understanding of the situation, really.
And that that was what really informed the founders of the National Science Foundation, what they called basic science. And it's something that's not at all encouraged now by science funding, or at least by the writing of proposals. Yes?
Oh, Cornell Green, thefailureguy.com. Interestingly enough, I'm here from a socioeconomic perspective. I'm launching thefailureguy.com next year, and I'm looking to do a podcast series where I interview successful people in business, politics, etc., about a seminal failure in their life. I consider myself, well, actually, I'm a small business consultant in what I call the post-crash economy. If we look at what happened in 2008, it was very obvious that the economy was built on a house of cards, and yet the entire world went along with the subprime mortgage nonsense. And in fact, in the world of business, failure is almost like Voldemort or the Candyman. No one even wants to talk about failure or even acknowledge that it exists. And that's why I'm looking to launch this website and this podcast series, because I work with a lot of startups and entrepreneurs, and failure is something which is why, forget the rate of how many businesses are going to fail within 5 years or whatever. I find that a lot of businesses don't even get off the starting block, because the concept of encountering that first failure so paralyzes them that they don't even launch. So I'm fascinated to be here and hear you guys discuss, because science seems to be the only discipline that actually acknowledges that failure is even a thing, much less looks at it. But in the context of that, I'd like to ask you guys, in your various disciplines, because you're here because this is the nature of this talk, but within the scientific community, how consciously is failure, the possibility of failure, the probability of it, the fact that it's a possible consequence, really dealt with and acknowledged within the educational aspects and the actual scientific practices and experimental domains?
Catherine, do you want to comment?
Oh, about education?
Yeah.
I mean, well, actually, I'm giving a talk tomorrow about
Yeah. Stay around. You came to the right
I'll
place.
I'll be here all day,
that's
both
great.
days.
sort of a new intervention that we generated from the sort of design thinking mantra of fail early, fail often. So teaching kids that failure can be a good thing. Oh, sorry. So I was just going to say that I'm giving a talk tomorrow about, sorry, can you hear me now? Is that better? Okay. I'm giving a talk tomorrow about teaching kids this mantra that comes from design thinking called fail early, fail often, where, you know, when you're in the middle of a task or trying to improve a product or trying to learn that failure can be a good thing along the way, and you should actually invite it and learn from that mistake. So that's some of the work that I've been doing, but I don't think that failure is really seen as a positive thing in education settings, and in fact, it's, you know, accompanied by lots of negative emotion and learned helplessness and all kinds of negative things. And I think with the current testing craze in education, for example, it's seen as this negative thing, right, can be indicative of low ability in a failing school. So I think in general, failure is looked on as a very bad thing in education, but
Yeah. Not just in education.
right. And I think Xiaodong's work obviously speaks directly to this, so maybe she can say more after you. But
Yeah, Jonathan?
Yes, I'm very interested in hearing your talk, and I'm struck by the parallels between your effort and what we do with our advanced science reporters, which is to encourage them to write about the process of science rather than just focusing on results and press releases. And when you look at the process of science, then you begin to dive into this wonderful ecosystem that includes so much failure and frustration, but it's seen as part of all seen as part of the process. And it's a much richer story than what you get in headlines.
Harry?
I was thinking about this. Now I'm talking about my own career as a sociologist of science. Okay, I've had two really, well, one really big failure and one small failure. The really big failure founded my career.
Really?
Yeah. And
I'd like to have you on my podcast.
Okay. And the small failure really taught me a lot. Okay, I'll tell you the details later if you like. But I'm just writing a book on methodology, sociological methodology. And what do I say? I say, this is what happened. But sorry, I cannot recommend failure as a good methodology.
Yes. Well, actually, I define failures as first attempts in learning using real experience. So I'm not looking to have a podcast series or a website about failing, but about what failure can provide and particularly getting over failure, getting through failure, and how it can inform us. Certainly, I don't want to teach people how to fail or to embrace failure. That's not the point. But as I said, especially I see in the world of business, people so paralytically avoid failure that they don't even start. They don't even try. Because failure is such a stigma in all aspects of society, no one even wants, especially in business, you can't even admit that you've ever failed.
I think we have a couple more comments.
So yeah, thank you. So I think these comments are really interesting, and something that I think Jutta said in passing at the beginning of her presentation comes to my mind as well, which is that some people in the sciences, let's say, I don't know the other areas you described so well, but some people are at a career stage where they're sort of allowed to fail, and that's often not the case for young students. Undergraduates probably can fail a lot because it's still a kind of safe environment. Grad students probably can't. Postdocs certainly can't because of the extraordinary pressures on the field for those who are seeking a certain kind of academic position, of which there are very, very few and many people seeking them. And so Harry was lucky that he could fail early and it turned out okay, but I think that's not going to be true for most people starting out at this stage. So that highlights, to my mind, again, a distinction between a kind of individual researcher or a small group and sort of the community. So in some of my work, I was really fascinated by individuals who could fail in these, I think, very productive ways, where the whole community has learned enormously consequential things from the fact that they were wrong on these very interesting, hard questions. That didn't always pay off well for the people who were wrong. It paid off for the community. We now know an enormous amount that we collectively did not know before, but that doesn't always redound to the benefit of those who helped us learn that. And so there is, again, I think, a question of a kind of life course for an individual and even for whole fields or subfields that I think it's helpful to keep in mind, that kind of bouncing between sort of small individual or small group and something like the community larger. And there can be benefits to one without benefits to the other.
Jutta?
Just very quickly, I've done some interviews with scientists. My postdoc did a lot of interviews with scientists, and there was nobody who had anything positive to say about failing or was even aware of the kind of day-to-day failures that we've been talking about. So that doesn't seem to be widely known in the scientific community.
Thank you all so much.
Hi, Xiaodong Lin from Teachers College and Cognitive Science. So what interests me is that when you guys were talking about all these different scientists from historical perspective, there's something missing there, I feel, is emotion. And it feels to me, because I have been developing stories about Einstein, Curie, and all these struggle stories for children all the past 5 years with NSF. So I was struggling by, actually it's very emotional. And this is very, and you know, everybody when things didn't work out, they say, sucks, you know. But from your data, I feel like they're so cool, you know, this, oh, it doesn't work out great. This doesn't work out wonderful. Maybe it's like that. But I'm just talking about one emotion issues related to failure, because that's the area I think generates all kinds of emotions. And that's why a lot of the Nobel laureates cry when they got awards, because there's so many, you know, sweet and sour feelings come out. And the other one is strategy. So do they all use the similar strategies across all 3 different cases? So, and then I'm also wondering with children that I work with, shall we reveal the emotional things to the teenagers when they are already emotional cooling with all the girls and the boys and all the images and perceptions? So shall we reveal the scientists' emotions and to the, you know, teenagers when we educate them about failure?
Thank you. That's a fascinating point. So I think one thing that historians and sociologists and philosophers have the great luxury to get to do is actually to immerse ourselves to the best that we can in a kind of affective or emotive world of these researchers, because we're not, because we do have we're trying to understand at some level the kind of human experience and human practice, and that is, as you say, often quite rife with emotion. These people are often extraordinarily passionate. And I think that feeds some of what might be seen as stubbornness later on, those who won't let go. It's seen as the rivalries and the race for this or that result, let alone accolade. So I think you're quite right to see, not just today, but indeed for almost any epoch in the history of science that we've looked at, and Pamela's work will speak as well to this from the early modern period as the most recent studies, that these activities are, the people who do them are often extraordinarily passionate. This is a question of what gets you out of bed in the morning and what do you stay up late at night thinking about. And that's as true for Galileo as for the members of Bicep 2 and everything in between. And so one thing that I find very interesting is in a recent turn in the last few years, maybe a decade or so, of ways to try to communicate about science with large audiences of non-scientists, away from a kind of merely or predominantly didactic mode, let me teach the content or teach the results, and not so much only to teach the method, but to teach to share something like the subjective affective experience. And there are many ways this comes up. There are podcasts and live monologues and all these wonderful things like Story Collider that some people here have participated in. And what's really fascinating to me when I put my historian's cap back on is the efflorescence of kind of available moments where scientists allow themselves to be seen as really very sharing subjective experience. They are subject to the whims of human passions and can fail and feel it very deeply. But what does that portray about the nature of science as a kind of larger communal established machine for producing reliable knowledge. So I think there's an interesting tension between the passions of the individual and something like one hopes the reliability or the solidity of a kind of broadly shared product at the end. And I think there's an interesting tension that we can play with or wonder about between the kind of individual hopes, dreams, fears, failures, crashes, and successes, and something like a set of systems or structures that might be bigger than all of that. And I think that's something that's, I think, an interesting moment to think through in the United States politically right now, and so on.
I'll save time to others.
Oh, thanks. I guess I'm next. My name's Tim Wu. I guess I describe myself as a failed scientist. Used to be in biochemistry, got picked up. So I make my living at the law school now instead as professor. And I have a, but my first pursuit in life was science. I'm on plan B or maybe plan C here. But I had a question, really, I think for Harry. Is your name Harry, is that right? Yeah. I had a question. I was very interested in your discussion of the fringe and the core. One of the things I'm interested in is the history of innovation, technological innovation, which is related, not quite the same as I think the history of science. And there's an interesting debate, or I guess, I don't know if debate's the right word, but there's two types of innovation that you tend to see. One, maybe at the core or not at the fringe, so large firm innovation, the classic model being Bell Laboratories, or maybe even today at Microsoft or Google or something. Where the advantage of that kind of invention or innovation is enormous resources, a very talented, usually the best people, or many of the best people. And then often in history people said, well, that's obviously where things are going to happen. But then historical record, there really are, at least in technology, examples of people, I don't know the fringe, but at least not, fringe might be one word, but at least outside the big companies doing the most significant things. The invention of the telephone, maybe the invention, I don't know how you want to count Google, invention of radio, FM radio, things like this here at Columbia. And they're not always like way in the fringe. They're not completely insane, but a little outside. And the big firms have this challenge that they're often cognitively, even though they have resource advantages, they have some cognitive limits. They're often trying to improve on what's there slightly, or they have the problem that the funder is not interested in things that might challenge the revenue model. This is a big problem for Bell over the 20th century, is they'd invent things and then Bell would bury them because they wouldn't fit the business model. So I wonder if there's a similar kind of, I bet you would know more about this, about the kind of core versus fringe in science, and whether in fact significant discoveries do happen at the fringe occasionally, or whether they never do, and where things are today. I'm just curious about this.
Well, I never thought about this before, yeah, but it's interesting. Yeah, I would have thought there's a very strong parallel, and this notion of the essential tension probably applies just as much in business. Remember, Google and everybody else started off as the radical innovation in somebody, and the Apple in the back of in the garage and all that kind of thing. Right. Yeah.
Apple being the other.
Yeah,
Apple being the other great example. But are things ever discovered by fringe scientists?
Oh yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And the thing is this: I say that the thing about the fringe is that the balance is different in how they choose what's valuable, but nevertheless, I'm sure that for science to proceed, it's got to have a few people who are, or quite a few people, who are in the crazy side of the fringe. Well, David was talking about the people on the quantum theory. You've got to have those people. Very few of them will succeed. Very few of them indeed. But some of them will, and they're absolutely vital.
I agree. Now, just to say very briefly, one of the things that fascinated me by the group that I wound up writing about was something, they were neither all the way out nor all the way in this sort of center-periphery model, which again I actually take very much from Harry's work. That they were, the people I wrote about had PhDs from elite programs in physics and were not pursuing traditional career paths in traditional institutions. So they had a kind of disciplined curiosity, if we can coin something like that. That they had they were aware of the tools, the chops, the way to pose questions, and they were open to a wider range of often pretty bizarre sounding questions that were not being pursued in the mainstream center. So it was that, again, maybe that's the tension that you described. They were neither all in nor all out. They could speak in a profitable way with experts in the center, and they also weren't, so to speak, limited by that set of questions or institutional prerogatives. And that's I don't know how you engineer that on purpose. We can find examples from history. I'm not sure if there's a recipe for that moving forward.
I wonder if, looking at the RAND Corporation or a think tank like that was really trying to, innovate quite self-consciously, whether that would give some insight into those dynamics.
Can I just say one more thing, which I kind of forgot to say when I was saying the first thing? I think, science is often held up as a sort of thing that's in opposition to religion. But actually, I think it would be it's better off to think of it as a kind of religion. Because the thing that the fringe scientists are going to have to do, since most of them are going to fail, is just hope that what they do will be recognised in a later life, even if they don't succeed in this life, And that's part of it, and maybe that applies into.
I make one last comment. You don't have to respond to this, but it is. People have been saying, "Well, failure is always demonized." In Silicon Valley, where I spent some of my career, there is the attitude, whether you take it seriously or not, is a little bit different. At least in people's actions, people brag about failure being their badge of achievement or something, and it's sort of honorable to brag about some. It's honorable so long as you succeeded afterwards. The guy who failed and never went anywhere, that not a little less honorable. But most people get up there and talk about how they failed at something anyway.
Yeah, I think it's less useful to talk about religion than to talk about a discipline, a professional discipline. I think that idea of disciplined curiosity is really telling. Anyway, moving on.
Thank you very much. My name is Anne-Sophie Bauwich. I'm a postdoc here, and I would like to go to the question about retrospective failure, because there was kind of the agreement here, and I'm not so quite sure about that. So the question is well, how would you, for instance, evaluate failures today? And I think we might want to look at a different epistemology, because Harry Collins here said, for instance, that, there's a lot of social differences in how we conceive of science, and we need kind of a certain amount of fringe scientists. But that comes back to Andrew's question earlier about success. I think we need to think differently about success when we talk about ongoing science, rather than past science. Our epistemology is framed by, the history of science, the philosophy of science frames epistemology on past episodes. And I wonder, to what extent would our idea of success be different if we look at ongoing science, where we are not sure whether an explanation is correct, where the criterion of success is perhaps more the way it propels science by asking new questions that are somehow opening up new doors to new technologies, to integration. There could be different kind of criteria. And maybe the same holds for failure. So seemingly successful explanations are failures because they don't propel anything. They're just kind of data accommodation in a kind of an underdetermination sense. I was wondering what you make of that.
Well, I'll just say something very, very briefly. I don't know what to make of it, but one can practice, one can work out what one might make of it by thinking about string theory. Is it a success or a failure?
Some people would say it's a religion. I talked to one who actually left it. He's a physicist in recovery.
Yes, but that's a great example as well, because the original claim, maybe this comes back to something you two were saying, the original goals announced by the early proponents of string theory have clearly not been borne out, and I think even the proponents will agree on that. On the other hand, there have been all these unanticipated sort of productive collaborations outside that original course of study, because mathematical techniques developed in the pursuit of one thing have turned out to have all kinds of very productive roles to play in neighboring areas. So is that a success or a failure? It's a tool, it's a technology that's turned out to be much more malleable, plastic, and indeed generative than originally foreseen, even if the kind of religious-sounding original goals for many of these proponents have not yet been borne out. So maybe that goes to your point. This is propelling certain kinds of inquiry that have been stalled out in their own terms for decades in other areas of physics, in this case, and mathematics. So I wouldn't want to say, I wish we never had string theory at all, even if I am ambivalent about the claims of many of its strongest proponents, because it has had, we might call them spin-offs in a kind of Silicon Valley language. It has spun off incredibly productive techniques in neighboring areas that really have gotten through log jams in other domains. And I think that's something to be lauded as well.
Go ahead.
Well, just a very brief and perhaps obvious comment on that. I mean, I think that the way the question was posed was probably too broad, because there are, as we've seen, so many different notions of failure and success around that, depending on what you mean by these different concepts. I mean, whether you're talking about psychological issue, whether you're talking about personal successes or personal failures, or whether there is a sense in which we can even abstract from the personal or from the sociological notion of failure and just, or success, and say something about, oh, this, you know, idea was successful, depending on, independent of who had it. I think these are all questions that we have to answer before we can even start to frame the question or to ask the question that you asked.
Let me just say that in the Center for Science and Society, we are actually conducting an experiment on this in our Society and Neuroscience program. We have postdocs like Anne-Sophie who are working in labs. So Anne-Sophie is a historian and philosopher of science, and she is working in Stuart's olfaction lab and a neuroscience lab.
Failing successfully.
And one of the really interesting things that she's studying are dead ends in olfaction research. We can call them that for shorthand, I hope. and looking at these dead ends that in some cases are being resuscitated now is quite interesting in terms of real-time study of very current cutting-edge science. So I think that there are really interesting ways in which this can be figured out by having historians and philosophers of science, sociologists of science, you know, really embedded in labs. Thank you.
Thank you all for your remarks. Katie Taub, I'm in the philosophy department here. I'm noticing a tension between the conceit of the conference seems to be that we can consider failure as something like an epistemic virtue, something that will be beneficial and military for science. But then for the individual scientist, it seems very painful. So you said you've done these interviews and no one's happy about it personally, which of course makes sense. And so I was wondering if you could speak to how this kind of tension plays out in terms of how we think of science as a collaborative enterprise, because it seems like it introduces real antagonism between the individual scientist and their community when we look at sort of the long arc of scientific progress.
Mm-hmm. Jutta, did you want to say something?
I have to think about it for a minute.
Mm-hmm. I think that that's a really interesting question. Really speaks to your, your question, David, about how you can really reconcile the kind of personal, biography, history of science with science as a social activity. And I don't know the answer to it, but I think that they are at odds. I mean, and that is a challenge, I think, for historians and sociologists of science.
Yeah, part of the reason I ask is because this seems lacking from the kind of traditional stories we tell about the nature of scientific progress, in which collaboration, we've moved away from like the old single-souled genius model to this collaborative, productive model. And I feel like this piece is really missing. So I'm wondering kind of how we need to retell those stories in light of what you've been saying.
I mean, one thing is, I think that we can see when in the scientific community, when we talk to scientists, that there are different kinds of collaboration in the sense of some collaborations are suggested by the topic that people are working on, and it's clear that you need to have different people with different expertise to work on this, and this is where collaboration is something that's considered positive, but then there's the expectation that you work together that comes from the outside. Yeah. So it's kind of extrinsic force. And then collaboration is not perceived as something that is positive, and that, I think, also impacts thinking about, what do I consider as a success for myself or for the group, and what do I consider a failure for myself or for the group, depending on what kind of collaboration I would be in.
Thank you.
So I wonder if you can get any, I've never thought about this before, but I'm wondering if you could get anywhere, once again, by thinking about the analogy with religion, which is par excellence something where terrible pain is normally thought to be a precursor to success.
So scientific martyrdom.
Thank you. Please.
Hi, good afternoon, or good morning. My name is Henry Nass. I'm wondering, the U.S. patent system is now up to 9.6 million inventions, patented inventions, most of which never got produced, and gone to market. And I'm just wondering if that might be a very productive base to look for or to study failure in. And for instance, I have a patent called, it's not mine, Hurricane Dissipation System and Method. That was just issued in 2017. And of course, it was issued even before the hurricanes we had big destruction from. But I think this will never be produced either. And a second patent I might mention is one that apparently was a failure when it was invented and while it was in patent, but at least made a fortune soon after, and that's the fidget spinner, which you might remember. Okay. So is looking at the patent inventors database really a ripe core for study of this stuff?
Yeah, Tim.
I'll answer that.
Good.
I think patents are sought after for completely different reasons than products. Strategic reasons.
Yeah.
They want to have a big portfolio, honor. It feels like a reward to get a big certificate from the U.S. Patent Office. Sometimes they're used for money laundering, or pretending to have revenue. So there's like a million different purposes for patents and reasons that patents are sought after, having nothing to do with products. So I guess that's one. I'm not saying it's a crazy idea to look there. I'm just saying that you have to understand there's a huge number of motivations for seeking out patents.
You have to understand the patent system, basically. Yeah. 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 I wonder if patent systems differ in different countries, different nations. Presumably there might not be that kind of possibility in other places. I don't know. Interesting question. Stuart, last word.
I'll make this quick then because we're almost out of time. But I actually really just wanted to reiterate something that was brought up first by Andrew and then again by Anne, and its notion that if we think failure is retrospective, we should think success is only retrospective as well. And I'm reminded in particular, maybe this is the way to end the panel, on a wonderful quote from John Maddox, the longtime editor of Nature, who was once asked by a reporter, so how many things do you think Nature publishes that turn out to be wrong? And Maddox said, oh, well, that's easy, all of them. And of course, many of us having tried to publish in Nature would agree with that. But I think that's an important point, is that many times we think only failure is useful, can be explained or examined retrospectively or judged retrospectively. But I think success also really, we just have this pejorative sense that failure is one thing and success is another. It's harder to judge success retrospectively. I'd say, along with Anne, that the important principle is progress. And if you make progress with failure, you make progress with success. Progress is the issue, really.
So that's a good way to end, because the question is, what is progress? That is a question that I talk to my undergraduates about a lot, and that is presumably a question that's going to be raised in the next session, which starts at 11:30, failures of social regulation. So please stay around for that, because I think will get at the question which I didn't have a chance to raise, which is what kinds of implications of these incredibly expensive failures, and even if success, is made through them. So right now, though, let's thank all of our speakers and respondents.